There are secrets that cling to the shadows, desperate to be told. We drag them into the light. Welcome to Gravevale Echoes. A man's conscience is a quiet room. But what happens when a voice begins to whisper from its darkest corner? Tonight, we join a desperate doctor as he battles ruin, temptation, and a single, persuasive whisper from the shadows. In the quiet, respectable heart of London, in a study that should have been a sanctuary of learning and healing, Dr. Lin was a man besieged. The enemy was not a disease or a malady he could diagnose. It was a silent, creeping, and inexorable foe that had laid siege to his life, and its name was ruin. His study, once a source of pride, was now a monument to his failure. The room was dimly lit by a single, sputtering oil lamp that cast long, mournful shadows across the shelves of medical texts. He could no longer afford to update. The air was stale, thick with the scent of old paper, of cold tea gone untouched, and of the faint, bitter aroma of his own despair. He sat at his heavy mahogany desk, a man shipwrecked in his own home, and all around him was the evidence of his sinking fortune. The specter of his ruin was a tangible thing, a collection of paper ghosts that lay scattered across the polished surface of his desk. There were letters from his creditors, their language shifting from polite reminders to thinly veiled threats. There were final notices, their stark, black print a series of daggers aimed at his professional standing. There were unpaid bills from his tailor, his landlord, his wine merchant, a flurry of white paper that represented a blizzard of debt from which there was no escape. He was a man drowning in a sea of ink and obligation, and he had long since forgotten how to swim. He had not always been this man. He remembered, with a pang of grief so sharp it was like a physical pain, the man he used to be, a younger Dr. Lin, full of promise and principle. A man whose reputation had been built on a foundation of skill, of integrity, and of a genuine, compassionate desire to heal. He had been respected. He had been successful. But a series of poor investments, a misplaced trust in a charismatic but feckless business partner, and a devastating run of bad luck had eroded that foundation, leaving him on the verge of a precipice. Soon the wolves would be at the door. His practice would be seized, his good name dragged through the mud of the bankruptcy courts. He would be a pariah, a cautionary tale whispered about in the gentlemen's clubs he could no longer afford to frequent. This financial ruin was a heavy burden, but it was not the heaviest. There was another weight he carried, a secret that was far more corrosive than any debt. It was a burden on his soul, a heavy chain he had forged himself years ago, and its name was the Dane family. His connection to the wealthy, powerful, and reclusive Dane family was both his only potential salvation and the source of his deepest, most profound guilt. Years ago, as a young and ambitious doctor, he had been called to their dark, imposing ancestral home, Blackwood Manor. He had been brought into their confidence, made a keeper of one of their secrets, a terrible secret concerning the sudden and mysterious death of the beautiful young mistress of the house, Eleanor Dane. He was the man who had signed her death certificate. He remembered the event with a horrifying, sweat-inducing clarity. He remembered the cold, oppressive atmosphere of the manor. He remembered the grim, commanding presence of her husband, Captain Dane, a man whose grief seemed to be intertwined with a cold, terrifying resolve. He remembered the pressure, the unspoken threats, the understanding that had been reached. He had been a young doctor, eager to please a powerful and wealthy patron, and he had compromised. He had written "fever of unknown origin" on a piece of paper, a simple, clinical lie that had buried a truth he did not fully understand but knew, with a gut-deep certainty, was something far more sinister. That single act of professional cowardice had haunted him ever since. It was a stain on his conscience that no amount of time could wash away. The secret was a constant, low hum of guilt in the back of his mind, a whisper that would surface in the quiet, lonely hours of the night, reminding him of his own weakness, of the moment he had traded his integrity for the promise of favor from a powerful family. And now, his two burdens, his financial ruin and his guilty secret, had become inextricably, horrifyingly intertwined. The Dane family, with their long memory and their even longer reach, had become aware of his dire circumstances, and they had seen not a tragedy, but an opportunity to turn his complicity from a passive, historical fact into an active, ongoing conspiracy, an opportunity to buy his silence and his soul for good. He stared at the pile of bills on his desk, at the ghosts of his own failure. They were a life sentence of poverty and shame, but he knew that there was a way out. A dark, tempting, and damnable path had been offered to him. The knowledge he possessed, the secret he had guarded for so long, was no longer just a source of guilt. It had become a commodity, a potential lifeline, a terrible, gilded key that could unlock the door of his debtor's prison. All he had to do was use it, All he had to do was embrace the compromised man he had become and kill the memory of the principal doctor he had once been. The choice lay before him, stark and terrible in the dim, flickering light of his study. He could hold onto his last, tattered shred of honor and be consumed by the ruin he had brought upon himself. Or he could surrender to the darkness, embrace the conspiracy, and trade his soul for his survival. He was a man on the brink, and the abyss was looking back at him with a patient, knowing smile. Dr. Lin sat hunched over his desk, a prisoner in his own study, the silence of the late London night pressing in on him like a physical weight. The scattered pile of bills and final notices before him was a paper monument to his ruin, each one a testament to a life that had spiraled out of control. They were the symptoms of his disease. But on his desk there also lay the cure, and the poison. To the right of the chaotic pile of debts, sitting in a neat, cleared circle as if the other papers were afraid to touch it, was a heavy leather pouch. It was made of a dark, supple calfskin, and it was closed at the top by a simple drawstring. It was not a large object, but it possessed an immense, gravitational presence. It had been delivered just an hour earlier by a man who had not given his name, a man with a face like a closed fist and eyes that held no warmth. The man had simply placed the pouch on the desk, uttered the single cryptic phrase, a token of the Dane family's continued esteem, and had vanished back into the night, leaving the heavy, silent offer hanging in the air. With a hand that trembled slightly, Dr. Lin reached out and nudged the pouch. It was heavy, shockingly so. The soft leather contained not paper, but metal. He knew, without needing to open it, what was inside. Gold. He pulled the drawstring, his fingers clumsy with a mixture of fear and a desperate, rising excitement. He tipped the pouch, and a river of dull, yellow light spilled out onto the dark mahogany of his desk. Gold sovereigns. Dozens of them. They formed a glittering, chaotic pile, a small mountain of wealth that shone with a greasy, seductive luster in the dim lamplight. Each coin was a tiny, perfect sun, a promise of warmth and life. He picked one up. It was heavy in his palm, its milled edge rough against his skin. He saw the stern, noble profile of the king, a symbol of order, of power, of a world where debts were paid and good men did not face ruin. This was the devil's bargain, laid out before him in the most ancient and persuasive of forms. This pile of gold was a solution, a complete and total absolution for his financial sins. He began to do a quick, frantic calculation in his head. There was enough here, more than enough. Enough to pay his landlord and silence the threats of eviction. Enough to pay his tailor, his wine merchant, his book dealer. Enough to settle the disastrous investment and make his most aggressive creditors disappear. There would even be enough left over to live on for a year, perhaps two. Enough time to rebuild his practice, to reclaim his life, to once again become the respectable, successful Dr. Lin he had once been. The gold was a key. It was a key that could unlock the door of his debtor's prison and allow him to walk back out into the sunlit world of respectable society. It was salvation, in a small, heavy, glittering pile. He stared at it, mesmerized, his breath catching in his throat. The sheer, seductive weight of it was a powerful narcotic, numbing the sharp, stabbing pains of his anxiety and his despair. For the first time in months he felt a flicker of hope. A dark, guilty, and utterly thrilling hope. But the cure had its price, and the poison lay right beside it. Next to the gleaming mountain of gold lay a single, folded sheet of crisp, white parchment. It was held down by a heavy glass paperweight, as if to keep it from flying away, or perhaps, to keep it from contaminating the beautiful, simple purity of the gold. This document was the other half of the bargain. This was the bill for his salvation. He knew what it was. The nameless messenger had explained its purpose in a few, clipped, and menacing sentences. It was a sworn statement, an affidavit, a legal document carefully prepared by the Dane family solicitors that would, once signed by him, become a permanent, unassailable part of the historical record. With a hand that was now slick with a cold sweat, he lifted the paperweight and unfolded the document. The language was dense, legalistic, full of convoluted clauses and Latin phrases. But its meaning, its purpose, was horrifyingly clear. It was a detailed, and entirely fictitious, account of Eleanor Dane's final days. It spoke of a sudden, virulent fever, of a rapid decline, of his own constant, heroic, but ultimately futile efforts to save her. Praised his skill, his diligence, his compassion. It was a masterpiece of exculpatory prose. It was a lie, a beautiful, elegant, and comprehensive lie, designed to be filed away in a dusty archive, a permanent bulwark against any future questions, any future doubts. To sign this document would be to do more than just repeat the lie he had told on the death certificate. That had been a sin of omission, a cowardly act committed under pressure. This would be different. This would be a sin of commission. It would be a willing, conscious, and premeditated act of conspiracy. It would be a deliberate and permanent desecration of the truth. It would make him not just a man who had been compromised, but a man who was owned. He would become a permanent, silent partner in the Dane family's dark enterprise, his name and his honor forever shackled to their crime. The gold was not a gift. It was a leash. His gaze drifted from the terrible, white page of the document to the third, and perhaps most tempting part of the bargain, sitting silently on a shelf just beyond his desk. It was a small, dark blue glass bottle, no larger than his thumb, with a simple handwritten label. Tincture of opium. Laudanum. It was a part of his medical kit, a common remedy for pain, for sleeplessness, for hysteria. But Dr. Lin knew it was so much more than that. He knew its secret, seductive power. He had seen its effects on his patients, the way it could smooth the jagged edges of pain, the way it could quiet a troubled mind, the way it could transport a person from a world of suffering to a warm, hazy, and blessedly silent oblivion. The small, dark bottle was an escape. It was an escape not just from the immediate, agonizing pressure of the choice he had to make, but an escape from the consequences. It was an escape from his own conscience. He imagined pouring a few, dark, viscous drops into a glass of water. He imagined the bitter, earthy taste, followed by the slow, creeping warmth that would spread through his body. He imagined the guilt, the fear, the memory of his past integrity, all of it dissolving, softening, becoming distant and unimportant. The laudanum would not make the choice for him, but it would make the choice easier. It would numb the part of him that was still screaming in protest. It would silence the ghost of the good man he used to be, allowing the desperate, compromised man to do what he had to do to survive. The three objects sat before him on his desk, a trinity of temptation. The gold, a promise of worldly salvation. The document, the price of that salvation, a contract with the devil. And the laudanum, the dark anesthetic that would allow him to sign the contract without feeling the pain of his own soul's amputation. He was a man caught in a perfect, diabolical trap. The Dane family, with their centuries of cunning and their profound understanding of human weakness, had crafted it just for him. They knew his debts, they knew his guilt, and they knew the desperate, breaking point of a man who has lost all hope. They were not just buying his signature, they were buying his damnation, and they had laid out the tools for it so beautifully, so seductively, on the polished mahogany of his own desk. The choice was his, but the trap was designed to make only one choice possible. The study, which had been Dr. Lin's sanctuary, was now his Gethsemane. The pile of glittering gold and the stark, white document lay on his desk like a serpent and an apple, a primal, inescapable choice. The silence in the room was no longer just an absence of sound. It was a living, breathing entity, heavy with the weight of his indecision. He felt a suffocating pressure, as if the very air had grown thick and was pressing in on him, trying to force his hand. He pushed himself away from the desk, standing up so quickly that his chair scraped harshly against the wooden floor, the sound a sharp, ugly protest in the dead quiet of the night. He began to pace, a caged animal in a self-made prison. 4 steps to the window, 4 steps back to the fireplace. The worn path in the Persian rug was a testament to the many restless nights he had already spent in this room, wrestling with his lesser demons of debt and failure. But tonight was different. Tonight, he was wrestling with a demon that was far older, far darker, and far more intimate. He was wrestling with himself. As he turned from the fireplace, he caught his reflection in the dark, unlit glass of the window pane. The fog outside had thickened, pressing against the glass, creating a dark, murky mirror that showed him not the London street outside, but a ghostly, distorted image of himself, superimposed over the faint, swirling shapes of the mist. He stopped, staring at the man in the glass, and he felt a profound and chilling sense of detachment, as if he were looking at a stranger. The face that stared back at him was not the one he remembered. It was the face of a man who had been hollowed out from the inside. The eyes were wide, haunted, filled with a desperate, hunted look. The mouth, which had once been quick to offer a reassuring smile to a nervous patient, was now a thin, tight line of anguish. The skin was pale, almost translucent in the dim lamplight, and seemed to be stretched too tightly over the bones of his skull. This was not the face of Dr. Lin, the respected physician. This was the face of a cornered man, a desperate man, a man on the verge of selling his soul for a handful of gold. A war was raging inside him, a civil war for the territory of his own conscience. On one side was the man in the reflection, the desperate, compromised man who was screaming for survival. This man argued with a cold, brutal logic. He spoke of pragmatism, of necessity. What was honor, he whispered, when you were homeless? What was integrity when you could not afford to buy a loaf of bread? The Dane family was powerful, their crime long since buried. The truth about Eleanor Dane's death was a ghost, a thing of the past that could no longer be proven. To sacrifice a comfortable future for the sake of a forgotten, unprovable truth was not nobility. It was madness. It was a form of suicide. The gold was not a leash. It was a lifeline. To sign the document was not a sin. It was a necessary, unpleasant act of self-preservation. But on the other side of the conflict was another man, a ghost in his own right. It was the memory of the young, idealistic doctor he had once been. The man who had taken a sacred oath to do no harm, to value truth and life above all else. This ghost did not argue with logic. It argued with feeling. It spoke of the sick, churning guilt that had been his constant companion for years. It reminded him of the look in Eleanor Dane's eyes in her final, lucid moments, a look not of fear, but of a profound, heartbreaking pity for him, for the man he was allowing himself to become. This ghost whispered that some stains can never be washed away, that some bargains cost more than a man could ever repay. To sign the document would be to kill this last, best part of himself forever. It would be to trade a temporary financial bankruptcy for a permanent spiritual one. He stood there, frozen, caught in the crossfire between the man he was and the man he had been. He was two people, trapped in a single, trembling body, and the battle between them was tearing him apart. As his internal war raged, the room itself seemed to respond to his turmoil. The shadows, which had been mere patches of darkness, began to grow and deepen. The single, sputtering flame of the oil lamp on his desk seemed to flicker more violently, as if caught in an unfelt psychic wind. The shadows in the corners of the room, far from the lamp's weak light, began to writhe and coil. They were no longer just an absence of light. They felt like a presence, a dark, silent, and watchful audience, gathering to witness his final moral struggle. He felt their collective, unseen gaze upon him, a silent, ancient pressure that was far more unnerving than the judgmental stares of any human crowd. The darkness in the room was alive, and it was waiting for him to make his choice. It was waiting for him to join it. And through it all, there was the sound of the clock. On the mantelpiece above the cold, empty fireplace stood a heavy, ornate clock of black marble. It was the only other living thing in the room, and its voice was a torment. Tick-tock, tick-tock. The sound was slow, heavy, and inexorable. It was the sound of time passing, of his window of opportunity closing. But tonight, it was more than that. Each heavy tick was a hammer blow of temptation. The gold, each sharp tock was a stab of guilt. The lie, tick, your debts will be gone. Tock, your soul will be gone. Tick, you will be safe. Tock, you will be damned. Tick, your pain will end. Tock, your torment will begin. The sound was a torture, a rhythmic, mechanical heartbeat that amplified the crushing, screaming silence of his indecision. It was a countdown to the moment when he would have to walk back to that desk, pick up the pen, and choose which of the two men inside him would be allowed to live, and which would be sentenced to death. He pressed his hands to his ears, trying to block out the sound, but it was useless. The clock was not just on the mantelpiece. It was inside his head. It was the sound of his own heart, caught between salvation and damnation, and he did not know which way it would fall. The war for his soul was reaching its climax, and the shadows were waiting patiently for the victor to be declared. The relentless tick-tock of the mantelpiece clock was a physical assault, each second a hammer blow against Dr. Lin's frayed nerves. He stood in the center of the room, a man paralyzed by a choice that was no longer a choice. The battle was over. The ghost of his former, better self had been defeated, its honorable arguments no match for the brutal, pragmatic reality of his ruin. The desperate man, the survivor, had won. He knew, with a cold, sickening certainty that settled in the pit of his stomach like a lead weight, what he was going to do. He was going to sign the document. He was going to take the gold. He was going to sell his soul. He let his hands fall from his ears, and the sound of the clock rushed back in, a triumphant, mocking rhythm. It was the sound of his own damnation, counting down the final seconds of his integrity. He took a deep, shuddering breath, a breath of resignation, and turned to face the desk, to face the instruments of his surrender. And in that moment the clock stopped. The silence that fell upon the room was not the quiet of the late night. It was a sudden, profound, and utterly unnatural void. The heavy, rhythmic ticking did not just cease. It was extinguished, as if an unseen hand had reached into the clock's mechanism and frozen it solid. The abrupt absence of the sound was a shock, a sonic vacuum that made the air feel thin and brittle. The room was now holding its breath. The watchful shadows in the corners seemed to lean in closer. Something had changed. The rules of the game had just been altered. Dr. Lin stood frozen, his own heart seeming to have stopped in sympathy with the clock. His senses, already on high alert, were now screaming. The silence was not empty. It was filled with a new and infinitely more terrifying presence. And then he heard it. It was not a sound from the street outside. It was not the creaking of the old house. It was not a product of his own tormented mind. For this was a new sound, a sound he had never heard before. It was a faint, dry, and sibilant whisper. It was a sound like dry leaves skittering across a stone floor, like a serpent sliding through sand. It was a voice that was ancient, genderless, and utterly devoid of any human warmth or emotion. And it seemed to come from nowhere and from everywhere at once. It was in the darkest, most shadowed corner of the room, to his left. It was in the empty, cold air behind his right shoulder. And most terrifyingly of all, it was right beside his ear, a cold, intimate breath against his skin. He whipped his head around, his eyes wide, frantically scanning the shadows. But there was nothing there, only the familiar, dusty furniture and the deep, absolute blackness of the corners. He was alone in the room, physically alone. The whisper came again, a little louder this time, a little more confident. It was a sound that seemed to be testing the air, testing his resolve, savoring his terror. It was a voice that had been waiting patiently in the wings for his internal battle to be over, waiting for him to be at his weakest, his most desperate, his most corruptible. He knew, with a certainty that was colder and sharper than any fear he had yet experienced, that this was not a hallucination. The silence of the clock had been a deliberate act, a clearing of the stage for this new, terrible actor. This was not a ghost of his own making. This was something else, something external, something that had been drawn to him, to this room, by the sheer, raw stench of his moral decay. He had stood on the edge of the abyss, and now the abyss was whispering back to him. The whisper began to form words. The words were not spoken aloud. Like the phantom voice in the coffin, they bloomed directly in his mind. But these were not words of sorrow or of shared fate. These were words of pure, simple, and exquisitely tailored temptation. They were a distillation of every weak, self-serving argument he had just been having with himself, now given an external, supernatural voice. The whisper coiled around his thoughts like a plume of thick, narcotic smoke. It was a sound of pure, honeyed persuasion, a voice that knew his every fear, his every weakness, his every desperate desire. "Sign it," the voice whispered, its sibilant tones a caress of pure evil. "It is only paper, only ink, a formality. The lie is already in your heart. This is just the consummation." Dr. Lin squeezed his eyes shut, a low moan escaping his lips. "Who are you?" he breathed into the silent room. The whisper chuckled, a dry, rustling sound like a snake shedding its skin. "I am the voice of reason," it hissed in his mind. "I am the voice that tells you to survive. Look at the gold, doctor. Feel its weight. It is real. It is solid. Can save you. Your honor, your guilt, those are ghosts. They are weightless. They cannot feed you. They cannot shelter you from the cold." The voice was a master seducer. It did not threaten. It did not command. It merely agreed with the darkest, most desperate part of his own soul. It validated his weakness, celebrated his fear, and offered him an absolution for the crime he was about to commit. "Take the gold," it continued, its voice a soft, persuasive purr. "The Dane family is powerful. They will protect you. They will reward you. Your troubles will vanish. Your practice will flourish. You will be a respected man again. All for the price of a single, forgotten truth. A truth no one else knows. A truth that died with a foolish woman years ago." "She was not foolish," Dr. Lin gasped, his own voice a pathetic, trembling defense of a woman he had helped to condemn. The whisper laughed again, a sound of pure, cold contempt. "She was. She chose a forgotten truth over a comfortable life. That is the definition of a fool. You, doctor, are not a fool. You are a survivor. You understand the way the world truly works." Dr. Lin stumbled back to the desk, his legs unsteady. He braced himself on it, his knuckles white. He stared at the terrible tableau before him, the pile of glittering, seductive gold, and the stark, white lie of the document. The whisper was right beside him now, a constant, sibilant presence in his ear. "Your pain will end," it coaxed. "Imagine it. No more sleepless nights. No more fear of a knock at the door. No more shame. Just peace. Just comfort. Just the satisfying, heavy weight of gold in your pockets. It is so easy. Just a few strokes of a pen." He looked at the pen, lying next to the document. It was a simple black fountain pen, an instrument of healing, of prescription, of learning. Now it was to be the instrument of his damnation. "No one will ever know," the voice whispered, its final, most potent argument. "The The secret will be buried forever, locked away under a mountain of legal documents and gold. Your part in it will be a footnote, forgotten. It will be as if it never happened. You will be free. It was the ultimate lie and he knew it, but it was the lie he desperately wanted to believe. He would not be free. He would be owned. But he would be safe. He would be solvent. He would survive. The whisper had won. It had simply held up a mirror to the ugliest, most desperate part of his own soul and told him it was beautiful. With a hand that was now eerily steady, Dr. Lin reached out. He uncapped the pen. He dipped its nib into the pot of black ink. He moved his hand over the document, the damning affidavit. The whisper fell silent, its work done. It was now just a watchful, expectant presence in the room, waiting to witness the final signature on its contract. He positioned the nib at the bottom of the page, on the line designated for his name. Dr. Alistair Lin. He paused for one final, fleeting moment. The ghost of the good man he had been made one last, silent, desperate plea. But it was too late. The whisper from the void had shown him the path of least resistance, and he was too weak, too tired, and too afraid to fight it anymore. He pressed the pen to the paper. The ink flowed, black and final. He began to sign his name. He began to sign away his soul. The offer has been made, not by a man, but by a voice in the dark. Dr. Lin stands at a crossroads between his honor and his survival, with a ghostly whisper as his guide. Where does this whisper truly come from? A ghost? A demon? Or the darkest part of his own soul? And what do you think Dr. Lin will do? Let us know below. The final page is turned, but the chill will linger long after the screen goes dark. Subscribe and return for the next secret we unearth.